Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my distinct pleasure to moderate the closing discussion of our Nuremberg Forum 2025. We have a terrific panel, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. 80 years ago, world history was made in this very courtroom. Often Nuremberg is considered the birthplace of modern international criminal law ever since. A fundamental legal principle of today's international criminal law is individual criminal responsibility, irrespective from one's office and person. That principle originates from the Nuremberg and the Tokyo trials. It was prominently enshrined in the first of the Nuremberg principles, and as can be read in the tribunal judgment of the International Military Tribunal, crimes against international law are committed by individuals, not by abstract entities. Today, we see the calls for pursuing justice, for accountability louder than ever, as well as the calls for a primacy of reason in the sense of Robert Jackson's appeal to reason. International criminal justice continues to be the interplay of law and politics, and perhaps the outstanding significance of the Nuremberg trials is that Nuremberg stands for the lasting relevance of legal proceedings addressing wrongs committed and crimes committed, and in the significance and effective force of a rules-based international order. I very much look forward to discussing some of these aspects going forward. In 1946, immediately after the International Military Tribunal was closed, so to speak, the first Secretary General of the United Nations, in a report submitted in furtherance of the proceedings in the General Assembly's first session, had emphasized the need for what would become the Nuremberg Principles to be made a permanent part of international law. This, according to the report, would be crucial for protecting mankind from future warmongers. And I quote, "In the interest of peace, and in order to protect mankind against future wars, it will be of decisive significance to have the principles which were implied in the Nuremberg trials, and according to which the German war criminals were sentenced, made a permanent part of the body of international law as quickly as possible. From now on, the instigators of new wars must know that there exists both law and punishment for their crimes." Here we have a high aspiration, a high inspiration to go forward and begin the task of working towards a revitalized system of international law. Now, indeed, we can also see that these principles, therefore, can be identified as a core element of the Nuremberg's indispensable, if complicated, forever legacy, as David Scheffer has put it. A legacy that perhaps strives to buttress and reinforce the work of negotiators striving to strengthen international criminal justice. In a 1997 piece, Henry King assessed the modern relevance of the Nuremberg Principles, and it's precisely relevant for our discussion today in the sense that he looked at how democratic institutions and the separation of powers can be protected and cherished. And I quote, "Nuremberg was the first post-mortem analysis of a totalitarian state. It gave us an appreciation of the levers of power in a dictatorship and of the defenses which have to be in place to prevent dictatorships and their destructive effects. And so, by remembering Nuremberg, we should renew our appreciation for these institutions which stand between us and the abyss: a free press, free speech, an independent judiciary, and balance between the three branches of government with a viable and living constitution solidly in place," end quote. Now, it is our grand task to precisely look at how to confront totalitarian regimes and totalitarianism more generally, from accusations of Siegerjustiz to the establishment of international structures espousing these values. The acceptance and interpretations of the Nuremberg trials have not been linear and have been quite an extraordinary process, and I'd like to delve into this in some depth with you going forward. We have two distinct experts on this panel, and I'm delighted to introduce our two expert speakers today. We have the privilege of having an American perspective and a German perspective, if you like, and a legal perspective and a historical perspective. So I'm really curious to hear your conversation. Allow me to introduce John Barrett. He's the Benjamin N. Cardozo Professor of Law at St. John's University School of Law, where he teaches constitutional law, criminal procedure, and legal history. He's also the Elizabeth S. Lenner Fellow at the Robert H. Jackson Center, and Professor Barrett is a renowned teacher, writer, commentator, and lecturer in law and history topics more broadly, and perhaps really interesting for our discussions today and of the protagonists of the Nuremberg trials. He discovered, edited, and published Justice Jackson's now acclaimed memoir, That Man, an Insider's Portrait of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and is currently at work on an authoritative biography of Robert Jackson. And we have Professor Andreas Wirsching with us, the now, I understand, former director of the Institute of the Contemporary History in Munich, Berlin, as of this week, just a couple of days old, and is a professor of modern history at the Ludwig-Maximilians University, Munich. He has taught at several universities, including Tübingen and Augsburg, and among other things is a member of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences and Humanities, held a Fulbright Distinguished Chair for European History, and was several times invited professor in Montreal and Paris. Delighted to have you both with us. So allow me to start with a wide question and thinking about marking the 80th anniversary in this particular moment in time and this particular set of circumstances and political climate. What are your reflections on this anniversary in this very year, perhaps compared to previous anniversaries, perhaps to previous discussions of the Nuremberg trials? So what are your personal, let's say, scholarly and reflections on the present moment and the way we think about Nuremberg today? Perhaps I'll start with you, Professor Wirsching. Andreas, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this invitation and this very important question to start with. First of all, I'm not absolutely sure if 80 years of Nuremberg is really a subject of our remembrance in Germany. I mean, here in the Saal 600, of course it is, but in the wider public, I'm not so sure. We have some established days of remembrance, like the 8th of May, of course, the 27th of January, the liberation of the Auschwitz camp, which has been introduced as an important day of remembrance. And we have, of course, the 9th of November with the pogrom against the Jews and the Hitler putsch in Munich in 1923. So there are many days of remembrance, but I'm afraid it's not so much the Nuremberg trials, which are in the focus of the culture of remembrance. Why is this so? I mean, I'm not going into the details of the shortcomings and the complexity and the ambiguities of the Nuremberg trials. That would be too long. But we know very well that most Germans, or many Germans, they approved in principle to the Nuremberg trial in 1945, but they were not so much preoccupied with it. Given the everyday hardships of survival, sheer survival in 1945 for the majority of the German population, the interest in the Nuremberg trial was limited. It was very much covered in the press and in the media, and there was a lot of discussion on German guilt, of course, but the wider population was not so much interested in the details. And that is understandable, and it's easy to explain, but it's a fact, and I would say that's one of the main reasons why this day of remembrance, or this event of remembrance, didn't have so much impact on the German culture of remembrance. On the other hand, it was, in my opinion, and it's necessary to remind that it was a watershed, not only as far as the legal procedure was concerned. I mean, the main perpetrators were tried, they were sentenced, they were punished, but there is more in that. It's a sort of, if you like, cultural watershed. Because what the Nuremberg trial did was to deconstruct or even to destroy the Nazi narrative, the main narrative, and we have to reconsider that, of course, in Nuremberg, the Nazi system had its showcase, its best side, so to speak, in the party rallies not far away from here, and the whole Nazi aesthetics was displayed here in Nuremberg. And this was, of course, an aesthetics based on the ideology, the racism, the anti-Semitism, the social Darwinism, war and destruction. And that was displayed here in Nuremberg in a very strong way. We have to remind ourselves that Nuremberg was one of the first hotspots of the early Nazi movement. Besides Munich, it was the city of Julius Streicher, one of the biggest hate rhetorics, and so on. So that was destroyed by giving the evidence, by citing the files, quoting the files, by hearing testimonies and so on. This narrative was completely destroyed, and it was not possible anymore after Nuremberg to retell the narrative of the Nazis. And that was, in my opinion, a very, very important achievement by the Nuremberg trials, especially by the main trial in 1945 and 1946. And I mean, in the early Federal Republic, we know that there were many continuities in the justice system, in the legal system, in the administration, in the ministries, in the economy, and so on. There were many continuities, but what was not possible was to retell Nazi ideology. That didn't happen, or it was not successful, and the Nuremberg trial contributed very much to that success, so to speak. So that seems to me important. And the second point, of course, is that Nuremberg was a model for what we today call transitional justice. And because you ask also about our present times, our current times, I mean, the last panel showed it already, the question how universalism and universalist justice can be achieved on an international level is one of the burning questions of our times. And in my opinion, again, Nuremberg was and remains a very important point and a sort of watershed. It was the first time, as you said in your introduction, that justice was tried. So perhaps I leave it with that, but that seemed to me three very important points up to today.
Excellent. Thank you very much for setting us off, and I'm sure we'll unpack the 3 points. Perhaps same question over to you, John.
First, my thanks for the opportunity to be here with you and for these 3 days of outstanding discussion. I endorse everything that was just articulated from a German perspective. If I'm voicing the American perspective, it is certainly true that the 80th anniversary of the Nuremberg trial is not like the 80th anniversary of D-Day or some other Klieg-light commemoration. In the general public, in the attentive public, and in the specialist community, this is a very significant moment. And I sort of ran the calendar backwards to compare it to previous moments, because I think each is characterized by a state of play among the attentive, the educated, the engaged, the successors. For example, the 70th anniversary, 10 years ago, 2015, was the creation of this academy and this institution and its support and its convening for contemporary international justice. The 65th anniversary was the creation of the Memoriam in 2010 and the gathering of representatives of 4 great nations who 65 years earlier had done this international trial. Sergei Lavrov was here cutting the ribbon and speaking from this dais in 2010. The 60th anniversary in 2005 was more or less the infancy, the creation of the ICC. It had just gone into effect, and that birth moment and that succession to Nuremberg was part of that anniversary commemoration. The 50th anniversary in 1995 was ICTY and ICTR, and that path to Rome that followed a couple of years later and became the ICC. So as you spin the calendar backwards, you see the significance of this has been large in each of these moments. I'll even jump way back to the 5th anniversary in 1950, which was the ILC and the promulgation of the Nuremberg Principles, and yes, but the Cold War. And yes, but the Cold War, in a sense that World War I, the Great War, the Second World War, World War II, was not succeeded by a World War III. The superpowers, for all of the danger of 1950, had found proxies and theaters and armament building rather than destruction of the European continent. And perhaps that was something of an anniversary accomplishment of what had been done and learned and studied here. So why is it a watershed moment starting 1945, 1946 and marching through these anniversary moments to the present 80th anniversary year? Well, fundamentally, I think the moment and its value of 1945 was the choice of trial, was the rejection of the stark executive action, summary dispatch, execution alternative, which viscerally would have been very satisfying to all the nations and their people who had paid such terrible tolls and won this world war. But the leaders of the nations and their principal representatives chose a trial path, which was not just a form of a trial, but was, as you know, delivered in this room in a due process model, in public, with a chance for defendants to take the stand, to call witnesses, to have access to documents, to, as Robert Jackson put it, give them, to get a fair trial of the type that they never gave to any of their enemies. And the achievement that came out of that choice, that real trial choice, was, of course, the verdicts, the individual judgments of the culpable defendants, the factual record that was developed during those many months of public trial proceedings, the dawning comprehension during those many months of the Holocaust. Because remember, this trial went in as a prosecution of the war, of aggressive war. And yes, count 4, crimes against humanity, embedded in count 3, war crimes, the word genocide, civilian suffering, occupied lands, and so forth. But that was not the priority. But of course, developing the facts means sort of finding and seeing rise the reality of what Nazi exterminationism had been. That occurred only because of this trial process and the record that was built. Another achievement, the legal precedents. We can argue about how precedented or unprecedented it was going in, but going out, there had been a Nuremberg that created a precedent for all future proceedings, and that is the precedent of international law and international jurisdiction, prosecution, accountability. That's the precedent of the specific crimes and their legal validity in international law. Those are the precedents of procedures as embodied in subsequent tribunals. And finally, I think the achievement is transitional justice in perhaps a slow motion sort of way. I want to introduce the word grandchildren here because it's a word that Jackson used privately, and in a very famous state paper to Harry Truman on the front end, he used the word children. But it takes generations. And the meaning of Nuremberg, it was embodied in one of the quotations that Pablo read at the start of the previous panel, is a slowly unfolding thing. Do we learn it? Do we live up to it? Do we use it? And transitional justice happened here, Germany, happened here, Europe. It took economic recovery and, of course, Marshall Plan support and so forth. It took education. It took distance so that children maybe asked their parents but didn't receive answers, but then grandchildren became the questioners, and then grandchildren became the adults, and frankly, the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, I guess grandchildren and great-grandchildren, fill this room. And that is really, in 80 years, the achievement and the power of Nuremberg.
John, excellent. Thank you ever so much for spinning that calendar backwards for us, and a powerful reminder of the precious moments in time that every decade or even every 5 years, one could mark the anniversary and something particular actually stands out, and also highlighting the real trial choice that was chosen. We've already spoken about how Nuremberg has been largely considered a watershed moment and what some of the legal achievements are. You've run us through eloquently and swiftly. Of course, Michael Scharf examines the how paradigm shifting the Nuremberg trials actually were, and it explores how this may be considered a Grotian moment. And I'd like to briefly come back to this idea of time that you ended with, John, and ask you both, how have perceptions of and perspectives on the Nuremberg trials shifted over years, over decades, and in the US, in Germany, and perhaps you'd like to speak also more widely, worldwide, and I precisely highlight legacies in the plural, given the multiplicity of legacies that have come out of the Nuremberg trials. Andreas, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the paradigms have strongly shifted since 1946, 1945. I mean, what was at stake first was the trial of the main perpetrators. And even if many Germans approved to the principle of the trials, the first trial especially, opened up some exit strategies for Germans, and that was the concentration of the crimes, the concentration of the atrocities, and so far on a small group of main perpetrators. Hitler himself, of course, but Hitler and his band of, say, 10,000 SS perpetrators, they were perceived, so to speak, as the system, a monolithic Führer state with a clique of perpetrators at its top. And that gave the Germans the opportunity to create themselves as a sort of victim group, victim society, so to speak. And it is well known that most Germans considered themselves as victims after the war. Not the Jews, not the East Europeans and so on, but themselves were the victims in their eyes. And the necessary precondition for that was, of course, to concentrate the crimes to a very small group of perpetrators. And just to quote one single article of the Frankfurter Allgemeine in 1955, 10 years after the war, there was, the author spoke of Hitler as a demon which is a very common paradigm at that period, a demon coming from the depths of the earth. The German, for those of you who speak German, I quote it in German, Hitler, ein aus der Tiefe hervorgegurgelter Dämon. That is one of my most favorite quotations, because it shows how, and I mean, the Frankfurter Allgemeine was not a very non-influential newspaper. It was at that time a very important newspaper and was to some extent representative for bourgeois middle-class meaning, intellectual meaning. So that quotation very well shows how this concentration of some main perpetrators allowed most of the Germans to have the perception the German people, the army, the Wehrmacht, of course, and the big majority of the Germans didn't have much to do with the Nazi crimes in Nazi period. And that changed, of course, but it took a lot of time. It took time until the grandchildren. That is, I would completely endorse that. And it was very important that since the late 1970s or even 1980s, I would say, in historical research, what was called Täterforschung, the research into perpetrators' actions and persons, of course, became very important. It started very often with grassroots associations, Geschichtsvereine on the local level, who wanted to know what actually happened in my town, in my city, and of course perpetrators were discovered everywhere. Big perpetrators, smaller perpetrators, and so on. And that changed the paradigm during perhaps 1 or 2 decades. And the consciousness arose that, of course, the Nazi system rested on a all-inclusive mobilization of the German society. And I wouldn't say that the Nuremberg trial was responsible for that time lag, so to speak, but it certainly played a certain role, because that was the picture of these main perpetrators tried and so on. And the second point perhaps should also mention, that is the history of Holocaust. I mean, it is well known that the Holocaust history in its narrow sense was not so much subject of the Nuremberg trials. The first trial especially, later on the Einsatzgruppen trial was more important, but it took some time until really in West Germany, in the Federal Republic, the responsibility for the sensitiveness for the Holocaust history was present. Of course, it was the Auschwitz trials in the 1960s, which were very, very important. The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, of course, was very important. And I mean, that converged with a new approach in research and a new approach of public discussion in the 1980s. Perhaps we leave it at that.
Great, over to you, John. Same question. How have perceptions of and perspectives on Nuremberg changed, particularly in the US?
Yeah, I think at the time, the US perspective, to generalize, was generally governmental approval. Obviously, it was a governmental decision. It was a governmental assignment, President Truman, Justice Jackson, and so forth. But in the time period, I want to put an asterisk on that. The military reaction was disapproval in the United States. And it was a sort of fellow officer sympathy for the Nazi military officers in the dock. And that is a published Army, Navy journal, etc., current of disapproval or dissent. And that is a not insignificant subset of opinion. The public generally, I think at a fairly visceral and unsophisticated level, liked this process and the accountability for those men because it satisfied the vengeance of the suffering victors who had paid the price of this war on a different continent. And connected to that was, in the early years, some education that came out of the record and the documentation, the understanding of what the Third Reich was and had done, and some value impact on the United States. I think the unfolding of the next 10 years in American constitutional law, including the formal disapproval by the Supreme Court of de jure racial segregation, is the lesson of the war come home. You could not defeat Nazi Germany and comfortably come home to American racial segregation without seeing in the mirror the problem of continuing that way. And that affected at least elites and power institutions and the formalities of American law. In personal life, of course, contemporary concerns kicked in: a demobilized army, a returning workforce, civilian life, economic concerns. All of that is more pressing, the baby boom, and all of that is the average American. Nuremberg is not on their mind in the 1950s. To the extent global issues are on their minds, there are new ones: the Cold War and here, the birth of West Germany, the FRG and the wall in 1961, the Korean War in the 1950s, the draft and the deployment of American soldiers to fight there, the Vietnam conflict beginning with military advisors in the early 1960s, become the Vietnam War. All of that causes World War II to fade a bit, and Nuremberg is a part of World War II to fade a bit in those immediate years. Later, it returns. The sort of celebratory commemoration of the greatest generation, the myth that the United States single-handedly won World War II, all of that becomes a kind of self-congratulatory, celebratory public mindset. And within that, there is trial study, again, specialists, experts, and Nuremberg appreciation. I think generally there is high approval and high admiration as a contemporary American perspective on this. And I think a part of that is the evil of the Nazis and what they were held accountable for. And another part of that is the high integrity of the Nuremberg actors, the United States representatives who were here and their international colleagues, the judges, the prosecutors, the junior prosecutors, down through the occupation army. Everybody contributed to something that was generally virtuous here. I was very glad to hear Pablo mention Telford Taylor, who sometimes gets skipped over a lot in the recounting of Nuremberg history. Of course, he wrote a great book about the Jackson trial and didn't write his book about his trials. But there were 12 of them, and there was nearly 3 years of Telford Taylor as the second American chief of counsel. And he's a man on a pedestal, as is Jackson, as is literally Ben Ferencz, as is, a lot of other people. They were high integrity actors in this hard work of international criminal justice. And I think that sort of sets a virtuous standard. I contrast it gently, perhaps, with Tokyo, which was perhaps a little bit more command dictated and foreordained, and perhaps in the bumps along the way, other justice processes, domestic and international, may not always live up to the high virtuous actor standard, but Nuremberg has in perception.
John, thanks very much for that. And I'd like to come back to the men on the pedestal, as you just called them, in just a moment. But perhaps as we're speaking on perceptions, one of the main critiques or core accusations that we're all familiar with is that of victor's justice. Today we see variations thereof. We've heard in the course of the discussions critiques of selective justice waged at more contemporary institutions. How has this perception of victor's justice colored discussions on the value of war crimes trials going forward and the acceptance of justice models, perhaps starting with you, John, in the US, or what you perceive globally, and then over?
I'm not sure I have a particularly national perspective on this. I have a general perspective. I have to say this critique has never resonated with me. I don't think there's much of a stain of victor's justice because, of course, obviously, in a public proceeding, you know who did Nuremberg. It was the Allied victors of the war. There's no mystery of the identity of the accountability actors. But in that moment and in this place, which was not Germany, it was the U.S. occupation zone of an unconditionally surrendered land, and it was a military occupation. Who else was there to do this? Perhaps there were German jurists and civil disobedient non-Nazi party members. You could have perhaps grafted in some German participation, but to do it fast, to do it here, to do it with resources really required the victors to do it. It was not rigged, which is what I think the substantive critique of victor's justice is. And where it applies, it's a serious critique, but this was not a rigged proceeding. It was a public proceeding. It proceeded on real evidence. It was real evidence that, yes, there was a conspiracy case and a kind of plan model as the prosecutors saw this, but lots of evidence that went to individual guilt. And so with free speech values, you can look at the Stryker verdict and debate the justice of this piece or that piece, but generally, beyond a reasonable doubt and a whole lot more, I think is what the tribunal decided the Nuremberg judgment on. Yes, it was dual purpose. Punishing lawbreaking was one purpose of the victors, the virtuous part, the evidence-based part. It also was a foreign policy decision. And the objective, the sort of dual purpose, was to decapitate German militarism. And that was obvious, apparent, discussed. There was a threat, at least perceived, and I think exaggerated in hindsight, but a threat that was perceived of resurgent militarism that twice in 30 years, having thrown this continent into world war, was right around the corner and poised to come back, unless this trial held accountable the generation who would have been the resurgent Nazis and taught the would-be followers not to be followers of that. And so the fear of a World War III and this trial being a mechanism to prevent a World War III was certainly a parallel purpose. I don't think that makes it illegitimate.
I would say that the German view on the victor's justice reproach was a bit different. It was very strongly combined with the tu quoque question, because of course it was addressed to the Soviet Union. And as far as I know, there was a lot of bitterness among many Germans and among German jurists as well, that the atrocities, the war crimes, etc. of the Soviet Union was not tried, of course. It was not tried. It couldn't be tried, of course. But the tu quoque combined with the reproach of victor's justice played a certain role. And I would say it's in my opinion, it's very parallel to what I said before, the shifting paradigms. The reproach of victor's justice was perpetuated until the 1970s, 1980s, and even today. I mean, if you give a lecture on the Nazi period and the aftermath, very often someone comes after the lecture and says, "But that was victor's justice and the Soviet Union and the US and indigenous people in the West and Australia and so on." So this, what we call in German,
the atomic bombs.
The atomic bombs, if you like. What is meant in German by, I don't know the English word, Aufrechnung, the accounting of different histories of crimes and so on. And so I would say the victor's justice motive is valid in Germany, and in my opinion there is a very strong influence, or rather strong, maybe hidden but strong influence of the defense attorneys, the German defense attorneys in Nuremberg, who managed to be quite influential in the first decades after the trials. Attorneys like Alfred Seidel, for example, who became Bavarian Minister of Interior in the 1950s and was an important politician of the CSU. He was the attorney of Hess attorney and others, Otto Kranzbühler, Rudolf Aschenauer, Hans Laternser, who was very active in defending the Wehrmacht generals, and so on. They succeeded in perpetuating sort of a German apologetic narrative surrounding Nuremberg that was not only victor's justice, it was also, as I said, tu quoque, the necessity to obey orders, Befehlsnotstand, and of course references to the well-known procedural shortcomings in the conduct of the trials, very often technical shortcomings. For example, the German sides, the defense didn't dispose of all the files and materials and so on. But that in general was a sort of apologetic narrative coming from this experience of the Nuremberg trials. And of course there were more elements, exogenous factors, for example. You very often heard the Versailles Treaty of 1919 had a very strong responsibility for the rise of Nazism and Hitler after the First World War. And these were, of course, the Western allies who were responsible for Versailles. And then, of course, the expulsion of the German refugees of the eastern parts of the Reich, which was the guilt of the Soviet Union, and so on. So there is a mixture of quite a couple of elements for a veritable apologetic narrative. But I would say the victor's justice is one of these core elements, but it's not the only one.
Thanks very much for putting that into context, especially in the German debates, and perhaps just following up directly on discussions in Germany and the positioning that Germany has. Germany was very critical of Nuremberg and the Nuremberg Principles until the early years of Germany's membership in the United Nations. And then, of course, we see a shift increasingly over decades. It took some time, but increasingly taking initiatives. And then after 1997, Germany becoming a driving force in the international arena in the pursuit of international justice. And I'd be curious how you might explain that, how and why has German policy on international criminal law shifted, and how has Germany come to terms with the crimes committed ever since, also in terms of judicial milestones you might wish to highlight?
I think the acceptance of international criminal law and Germany's participation in that whole process, and the fact that this Room 600 was established, I forgot your exact timeline, but that is part of it, of course, that Germany accepted its past and accepted the historical responsibility, perhaps not a sort of collective guilt, of course, but a sort of collective and political responsibility for the atrocities and crimes of the Nazi period as a whole, as a state. And that was achieved, in my opinion, in the 1980s. The 1970s, I mean, all has its prehistory, of course, and if you think of people like Fritz Bauer, for example, in Frankfurt, of course, he was one of those who were very insistent in speaking of concrete responsibility. But as a whole, as a sort of culture of remembrance, that was achieved in the 1980s. And of course, in the 1980s, there was a sort, in the final phase of the old Federal Republic, there was a sort of consensus which was fairly broad, I would say, and in that time, this new and of course after 1990, the Germans with reunification knew very well that they were obliged to follow this course because there was a sort of mistrust against a new Germany becoming possibly a sort of Fourth Reich or so. So it was all the more important to follow up this course of international multilateralism and of course the international law and the international criminal law process is a part of multilateralism, and that was a sort of raison d'être, raison d'état, you could even say. That was very important after the reunification of Germany, and in my opinion, that from the 1990s to up to today, as far as official German policy is concerned, this is the new German approach. And of course, most Germans would agree, yes, there is a strong historical responsibility, and the Nuremberg trials, who displayed this responsibility and this guilt, played a crucial role in that process. Today it's, I would say, completely affirmative.
Thanks so much. I think we could delve into much more depth, but in the interest of time, moving on, we would like to get into the role of individuals and how particular individuals are very closely connected to the Nuremberg trials, and there, perhaps John, starting with you, what do you see is the role of individuals and key protagonists of these courts? You've already mentioned some of the examples of these men on pedestals, you call them. There are many American men in that regard who are so intimately connected and immediately ring a bell. We, of course, have all of you have gone past the Benjamin Ferencz Square, which was inaugurated just last year, right in front of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice here. And so there is a fascination with the role of individuals for these crimes. So what is their role in the pursuit of justice and in confronting totalitarian pasts?
Well, I think the reality, and we know it from any institutional experiences we have, is that, in fact, it's just the people. And the law is just the people, and we will either, sort of get it right and achieve at a high level, or stumble and misfire based on the people. The luck, perhaps, or the discernment of the recruitment process, perhaps, resulted in a quite extraordinary cast of individuals who had responsibility for these decisions. This is Harry Truman. This is, in the end, a sort of reconsidering his preference for executions, Winston Churchill. This is, at Potsdam, Joseph Stalin, who decides to let his team at London agree to and stay in the alliance with the Allies and sign the London Agreement that brings this here as a four-nation project. It includes the newest and the weakest of the four states, but the French government and its actors, and then the individuals who were sent here to judge and to prosecute. And that includes the seniors and includes lots of juniors. The American staff in the end was huge, and many people did many tasks, from document translation and interpreting to trial brief writing to podium work. It's, of course, and I do have an interest in this regard, Robert Jackson at the top is the U.S. Chief of Counsel. He was America's leading legal figure, highly regarded by Harry Truman personally, and having been the U.S. Attorney General and a Supreme Court Justice and a very experienced trial lawyer and a little bit familiar with international law in the context of navigating around American neutrality acts in 1940 and 1941 to advise on how the U.S. could provide military aid to Great Britain, which became the Lend-Lease program. Jackson has the pieces and gets the assignment, and has a sort of strong due process, constitutional law, fairness reflex. It is a four-nation process, but the U.S. is the first among the four, and Jackson is the real architect, if you will, of these proceedings. All of these are very human people. They're doing something that is a startup. This is improv. We look at Nuremberg from the back end. We sit in courtroom 600. We have these institutions. We think Nuremberg. They thought they were in a place called Nuremberg, and they were hoping to make it till Friday. And every week was perilous with fumbles and stumbles and tempers and diplomatic clashes and bad press and so forth. The trial work involved lots of high moments and some fumbling moments. Jackson's opening statement is grand. Jackson's early cross-examinations of some defense witnesses are fabulous. Jackson's cross-examination of Hermann Goering is, of course, a very bumpy 2+ day passage. Ends fine, I think. I think his cross-examination of Hjalmar Schacht is worse. But I think his cross-examination of Albert Speer is much better. And that's true across all these people. That's trial work. But in the end, the evidence, sort of carries the day. The judgment reflects, I think, the proportion and modesty of what they asked for and what they were able to demonstrate. And thus it's represented in things like the Jackson Center and books and movies and words and everything that is Nuremberg attention today. You're not here for a movie review, but I want to put in a couple of sentences about a film that comes out on November 7th called Nuremberg. I understand that a fellow came to the memoriam last year and people were like, oh my God, that's Russell Crowe. Because Russell Crowe will appear in this film and plays Hermann Goering, and I've seen the film. He's brilliant as an actor generally, and in this role of playing Mephistopheles, he embraces it and does it beautifully. But the film is terrible history. It's dreadfully inaccurate history. And so I don't know if it will be popular, but if it is popular, and if the public thinks that that was Nuremberg, we have work to do. I hope that the actors get plenty of acclaim, and that's art, and they're entitled to, you know, their performance and their display. It's Rami Malek, and it's Michael Shannon, and it's Russell Crowe. I'm not criticizing them as actors. To the extent the film is meant to be Nuremberg rather than Goering, which is actually what the film is about. It's a Marvel comic hero story about Hermann Goering. I question the artistic judgment. You know, some of the focus on people is best done with the real facts about what actually happened here, involving real people.
Thanks very much, John. Of course, Nuremberg has been the source of rich literary and artistic contributions, so it'll be really interesting to see what that Hollywood take does for interpretations of Nuremberg or public perceptions of Nuremberg in the widest sense possible. Perhaps as we come to the close, I'd like to return to this idea of how trials or the law can confront totalitarianism. In Europe, the 23rd of August every year is European Day of Remembrance for Victims of Totalitarian Regimes. The date recalls the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, which opened the way for totalitarian aggression, occupation, and mass suffering. And the commemoration serves as a moment of respect for the millions of victims, but also importantly, the reminder to need to safeguard these basic democratic freedoms against authoritarian threats. And Jackson, in one of his final sentences in the opening of the Nuremberg trial, also says very iconically, judicial action comes after the event. So I'd like to put to both of you that interrelationship between prosecution and prevention, which ties nicely to the previous panel that we just heard on prevention. Hannah Arendt, one of the first theories to really think thoroughly about totalitarian regimes, would say that totalitarian regimes fail or would fall, but totalitarian thinking is a different matter. So what do you consider the value of law trials, such as the Nuremberg trial, but perhaps more broadly, in confronting totalitarianism today?
I would rate the role of transitional justice, if you like, very highly. And I mean, the Nuremberg trials were the first successful event in that respect. I mean, after the First World War, there were some ideas of having the German Kaiser and his entourage tried, that failed, as we know. So the Nuremberg trials were the first successful, in general, successful trials in that respect. And I mean, all totalitarian states or dictatorships tend to turn over the law, the rule of law, and to invent a different law, which is not law in a proper sense, which hides crimes and creates a new moral of legitimizing crimes and so forth. In that respect, I would say it's absolutely important to put the rule of law again in existence, and I mean, I'm not a jurist, not very familiar with the detailed history of international law, but I would say the Nuremberg trials as a model serve as a very important precedent for today as well. And I mean, what was of course a big success was the International Criminal Court on Yugoslavia, which, I mean, we know in Europe, the post-Yugoslavian wars, civil wars, and Srebrenica and so on, were the biggest crimes against humanity even since the Second World War. And that was very important. If it has a preventive role, I'm not so sure, frankly spoken. And I mean, today we see that dictatorships around the world, or dictators around the world, are not very anxious about being tried one day. And it remains to be seen if the idea of international criminal law and criminal court, The Hague, of course, will succeed in getting new perpetrators before the court. And I don't know, but I must say I'm not very optimistic in that moment, but that may change during the years to come.
Thank you, John.
I don't mean to diminish Nuremberg, but I want to say carefully that in some senses it was quite easy to do Nuremberg, because the war had been won and the consensus was total and the power was enormous. Remember, Jackson in his opening refers to it as the greatest tribute that power has ever paid to reason. Power is the predicate. That's the politics of these accountability processes. And so in comparison to Nuremberg, accountability processes today that don't proceed with that amount of power and don't have that consensus of all the states or all the great powers behind them are much harder endeavors. And you, of course, who do this, know this concretely, directly. And that goes to the prevention effectiveness. Nuremberg had in the dock, in the prison, it is a little sobering to be in this room, and it's a very high honor, and to gesture towards the defendant's box here is not something that I do lightly, but I do it with a real sense of the reality of this. To have that kind of power and to use it in this way created accountability and did incapacitate, decapitate, educate, permit the transition that is the path from Germany then to Germany today. And in contrast to that, contemporary accountability processes are climbing steeper hills.
Thank you very much, John. Are there any final comments with which you would like to leave us here today?
I mean, much has been said already, and I can only repeat perhaps the main element, in my opinion, historically speaking, that Nuremberg is a watershed, was a watershed, but it has certainly come under pressure in recent times. And what you said, what John said about the power which is necessary to act forcefully in terms of law is of course completely right. And so today, I mean, the model of Nuremberg has its relevance, but we need to re-event, so to speak, this relevance again and again in order to be capable to act today. And this is perhaps one of the most important legacies and lessons learned, so to speak, of Nuremberg.
It's a daunting model to always remember what Nuremberg was, who did it, and how they did it. And it sounds like slogans, and they're empty, except for those of us who reflect on it. It is rule of law. It is moral values. It is a commitment to human rights. It is a deep disapproval of military aggression as a way for states to coexist on this planet. It is a distinction that sees the legitimacy of self-defense against aggressors. And it's a continuing project. I mean, that is what this academy is. That is what these international institutions are. That is what our teaching is, our writing is. And I guess what I wish for all of us is what you already bring, the high integrity and the commitment to this. Plus, I wish us all stamina.
Thank you. Wonderful words to end on. I think I want to thank you both for providing your expert views on perceptions, perspectives on Nuremberg, and this tour d'horizon of interpreting, reinterpreting Nuremberg and what it has to offer for the present day. I want to thank you both very much. It was a great conversation. It could have gone on much longer, I anticipate, and please join me in thanking our two expert panelists.